Good morning, subscribers. Welcome to episode 21 of Complex Humans. My guest for today is Mr. Paul Brown. I know Paul because he's one of the lecturers in my Creative Intelligence and Innovation Bachelor. How are you, Paul?
Good. I think a bit scared. What if I say?
What's that?
What if I say something accidentally? No.
Well, it's the internet, It's a
Yeah.
more forgiving medium. So maybe if you could just tell us something about yourself and the thing that you do here at UTS.
So I'm a researcher, academic. So I spend like a huge amount of time just researching all sorts of stuff. Like
Mhm.
in my main area, kind of have a few areas. My PhD was in it's corporate governance, and it was
Mhm.
about kind of senior executives and how they're paid using kind of theories from financial economics and a few other spaces. But
Mhm.
I kind of have moved into more sustainability based research. So I kind of spend most of my time researching how. I think the key question I try and have a stab at is how can you create organizations that are sustainable within the context of a sustainable society in terms of.
Mhm.
So I kind of look at some of our work is very much at a very micro level, very much about decision making and information to like specific actors within a network making a decision to try and be more sustainable, and then a
Mhm.
little bit about kind of things at a higher level as well, kind of institutional level stuff. Yeah, and I do
Cool.
other well, and I teach, of course. I love teaching VCI students because they're very cool.
Yeah, it's just that last night I was in the IQ2 debate, and the proposition was, are humans designing our own? Is humanity designing our own demise? And it seems to be like I did ask a question last night, and it seems to be that everyone was focused on Silicon Valley and apps, but that's not. My question was, that's not the world. Like humanity is not Silicon Valley, and
Yeah.
design is not just apps. So maybe you could give us some idea of what's going on in the sustainability space. So it's not just all about the Facebook, the Googles, and all these platforms, but there are other stuff going on. Maybe you could give us some examples of that.
Well, I agree with your point totally, and that is that I mean, even if you look at, I mean, I do a little bit of like teach a subject that I last this year on startups, for example, and it was kind of an interesting area to play in because my intuitive understanding of a startup coming from more of a kind of economicsy kind of sustainability background is a bit broader than say the general term startup that's used in I guess contemporary discourse like you're talking about. So you actually have
Hmm.
there's a large group of people who kind of see the future of innovation in a perhaps slightly narrower view, I guess.
Hmm.
Whereas if you think about it and you go, okay, um, a lot of the activity I in that space, very much the kind of tech space, still conforms to certain basic economic principles. So you have a level of centralization once people get scale. So a lot of kind of startup businesses are essentially created around a model. Say, let's take the advertising model, where they're essentially trying to create some sort of mechanism that's allowing advertisers to advertise or get contact with people that wouldn't normally otherwise get contact with. And so I'm a little bit skeptical as to whether that sort of business model. I mean, if everyone did that business model, it's very hard to imagine a sustainable future
Mm.
because what you've got is a bunch of small players and medium-sized players kind of acting on the whim to some extent of much larger players and capital owners. So, in terms of sustainability, in the sustainability space, there's a lot of talk about the role of tech and the role of
Mm.
that sort of innovation very much as a way of enabling more sustainable business models to emerge. But the underlying
Mm.
system business model exists in the world. It doesn't exist in digital space because at some point in time, human beings need to eat.
Yeah.
But we all got to like go on shit, right? And we have
Yeah.
to engage in like normal activity. It's not. I mean, there's obviously people have their digital lives and there's a digital world, but in terms of the kind of the very basic structure of the economy, there's all this other stuff going on. And so if you look at the total spend of individuals, if you think about your own pay packet, you know, I get X amount of money in. Where does that money go? Well, a huge amount of that money goes to your landlord or buying a property, and
Mm-hmm.
so a huge amount of that money goes on, I guess, food. Yeah,
Mm.
and a few other kind of necessary things like energy, and then you've got what's left over, which is I guess your discretionary income, and then you can choose to do what you want with that discretionary income if you have any, because a lot of people don't actually have a lot of discretionary income, particularly the working poor in Australia and other
Mm-hmm.
parts of the world, and I mean students don't have a lot of discretionary income, you know, just
Mm.
by I mean, you know, if you look at kind of the gig economy, for example, there's a huge number of people who are putting on a brave face and they're kind of working in this very unstable environment, and their discretionary income is quite low and very risky. They don't know if
Mm.
they're going to get a lot of money in the future. And so, if you want to build a sustainable society, I guess one of the key things is you've got to actually tap into what the actual key economic activities are that are causing unsustainability.
Mm.
Have to somehow make sure that all those flows, like all this thing that we're spending our money on, all this, when I say spending our money on, I'm using that also as a proxy for our time as well.
Mm.
Because, you know, you can, you know, spend an hour at work, or you can spend an hour kind of doing some sort of community or art based thing. So if you want to have an actual sustainable society, you're looking at, you know, property, you're looking at work. How do you actually have organizations that are kind of creating jobs that are by the construction sustainable, and, you know, kind of food systems, you know, consumables, how do you make them sustainable? Now, if they're sustainable, then there's an opportunity for the world to become sustainable. But if they're not sustainable and everyone else, let's say all the young people focus on kind of the tech, when I say the tech
Mm.
space, I don't mean that in a naive sense that, oh, look, you know, be afraid of tech or whatever. I'm just saying, if you write an app, for example, and if all the kind of young, brightest people in our society are focusing on this very narrow area,
Mm-hmm.
then you really have to ask, you know, if that area became sustainable in a ecological sense and everything else wasn't sustainable, society would not be sustainable.
Mm.
So this introduces a challenge. So I'd probably, this is a very long-winded way of saying that a lot of the big work and important work in sustainability is actually focusing on rather banal areas that are perceived as perhaps less cool, but will probably have a bigger impact. So one being agriculture. We're going to agriculture where we are trying to
Mm-hmm.
find make more sustainable decisions with respect to water, air, energy efficiency. So in
Mm.
the efficiency space, there's a huge opportunity for startups and tech incubators to be involved in that. And a good example would be BS's Energy Lab. We've got people like there's a specific person would be Murray Hogarth, who has an organization called What Watches, to start up new using tech to enable people to become more energy efficient. So
Mm.
yeah, so yeah, I'd say
Yeah.
a lot of work happening out there. You know, is happening that's not happening in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. There's actually many threads I want to follow up on what you said.
Sorry,
Um,
I tend to
yeah,
ramble.
because I remember like Sam Altman, who's now the president of Y Combinator. He's big on energy because as he said, if you solve the energy problem, a lot of other problems will be solved. It's like
Yeah,
clean water. It's ultimately an energy problem. If you could find a cheap way to purify water with cheap energy, then that will solve a lot of problems. And that's why it's interesting. Like interestingly enough, I think they had a nuclear startup, nuclear power startup in one of their batches. And it also goes to this issue that, like what Peter Thiel has mentioned, is it's this 0 to 1 thing. The hard thing
yeah,
is going from 0 to 1, and incrementalism is easy. So, for example, he mentions that the next Bill Gates didn't create an operating system. The next Mark Zuckerberg will not create another social networking platform.
Gotta do something different.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard thing, and I think we're now getting into the. I think most people have done the lower hanging fruit of digital. I
Yeah.
think we're now getting to the real world problems where it's now atoms. 'Cause
Yeah.
bits are easier to move around than atoms. Now we're hitting the atom part, and how would you motivate, like, let's say, students to focus on that instead of, because a lot of students are, we're all glued to devices and stuff. How do we focus people to really look at the real problems?
Um, Interesting question. I don't think there's any one answer, right? But
Mm-hmm.
one thing is important is people need to have. There's a whole range of things, right? So one of the things I think is probably most important is a attachment to nature. So
Mm.
having this conversation last night, or forming this conversation with um, one of my people I really look up to, who's the outgoing CEO of the Environment Defenders Office,
Uh-huh.
Sue Higginson, and we're talking about this challenge of like how do you engage people, and she made a really good point, which I totally agree with, which is the necessity for individuals to essentially feel something like real nature. I mean, not
Mm.
just a local park, but pristine natural environment. Uh, because if you, because there's something about nature that just is,
Mm.
we are part of nature. I mean, people talk about like humans being kind of, perhaps building something that's unnatural, but we are part of nature. It's just that we've displaced a lot of what was there before. So if people have an affinity with nature, there's there's at least a possibility that they're going to, within their decision making context, make more ethical and more appropriate decisions. So, and this kind of obviously extends to kind of community as well. The idea that if you're attached to your phone, you're not necessarily attached to other human beings in a meaningful way.
Mm.
Kind of allow people to live more fulfilling lives is to kind of provide opportunities for kind of real attachment, real authentic engagement. So that's one thing. So this idea of some sort of authentic engagement with nature, I think that's important. And if we can provide mechanisms to allow that, I suspect, and students that do feel something for nature and feel something for their fellow human beings tend to act on it. I mean, some of the cool BCI projects come out of individuals who have some sort of like a real empathy for something.
Mm.
So, I mean, you can think of examples, of course. I mean, I can think of examples of someone like, oh, what is it, Shanae that's into bees, and it's like there's a real
Mm.
connection there between nature and the individual, and so other students who actually are taking action and designing ideas and engaging in discourse to actually do something to help and work with these areas for which they feel a lot of empathy. And that's one part of it. Now, I think the other part of it would be scientific understanding.
Mm.
So I would argue that, and this is maybe a yeah, agree with this, fair enough, right? But I would suspect that you know this idea of postmodernism that was quite present and became a big part of discourse, I guess, in the generation before mine, and which kind of has infected my generation and then the following generations, is this idea that people have kind of confused this kind of notion of the ability for people to uh, make personal choices about how they interpret the world, which I think is important.
Mhm.
So people are able to choose whether they want to believe in God or not, or some other kind of choice, which is essentially a social choice. It's a personal preference. And so people have
Mhm.
confused this idea, that, and very important idea, that individuals, that their decisions they make in their head influences kind of the reality that's out there. Yeah. So, and that there are multiple realities that can exist simultaneously. And this is
Mhm.
true in the social world. Yeah. So that's why you can have kind of two different belief groups living in coexistence, because they respect each other and they don't try and insist that one is right or one is wrong. Right. So this is a good thing. And I think, within the postmodern debate about kind of the idea that there's no right or wrong answer for a range of questions. I think has an important role to play in that sphere. But what I think's happened is a lot of people have taken this idea, which is important, and they apply it to areas where it. And so you have these kind of people that go, I don't believe in climate change, which is the most absurd statement you could even make. Like, it's almost like saying, I don't believe in gravity. It's kind of like this idea that if you believe something, it's right, and that's okay. And so this idea is very unscientific, because within science, you say, I think this could be right, and then you put it up as a hypothesis, and then people kind of just critique it, and there's like evidence, and there's discussion, and it's not that you can get evidence for everything, but there's a kind of like an evolution. And at some point, most people that have actually stated something that they believe that is true have been shown that they're not entirely true. So Newton said, I think this is how it works, and he kind of documented it, and then, what he said is still correct, but we have a more nuanced understanding of it now. So it's not that he was wrong, it's just that we've got a more nuanced understanding. So I think if students have a more scientific understanding of the world with respect to things that pertain to scientific knowledge, then there's actually something that just will happen naturally, and that is that all of a sudden they go, oh dear, we're going to run out of food. Oh dear, there actually isn't enough land to grow trees to offset the carbon we're emitting.
Mm-hmm.
It's just physically not possible. So therefore, a lot of the policy actions of our government and other governments are just not going to work. They're going to go, well, actually, when climate change is already having an impact right now on my own life, it's having an impact on, and the next generation is going to be impacted. And there are certain things we can do about it, and there's certain things we can't do about it. And so I think this increased scientific understanding naturally forces people to engage in the world in a different way. I mean, obviously, there's a side point. There's a whole bunch of psychology that would suggest that if you provide people evidence, they'll interpret it in they might not understand it, or the brain might kind of do some sort of trick where they kind of reject it and kind of rationalize it. There's a lot of work to be done there. There's a famous paper by a psychologist called "The Dragons of Inaction." If you're interested, really cool. Kind of outlines a whole bunch of reasons why people might not be able to buy into kind of a more scientific understanding of the world.
Yeah,
but you know what I mean. If for example, your property prices, the way the property. I'll give you another example. By Piketty, he's one of my favorite economists, because he's kind of like a hardcore economist, but he's uses evidence. He doesn't he's not driven just by ideology, I guess. But what's happened is that because he has this evidence base, it has actually become a level of it by putting the evidence out there about how the economy works, it confronts. It's almost like truth to power. His evidence confronts dominant paradigms with respect to economics. And so one of the things I like about Piketty is that, which relates to you and your generation, is that he actually tracks how the economies have worked in around the world to some extent over time. And he has worked out something that other people have worked out. He kind of documents it quite nicely, that a lot of people today are locked into a economic system that mathematically is kind of going to prevent them from kind of living a completely fulfilling life as per previous generations. Specifically, property prices is the most obvious example, where we put a lot of our money into rent. So rents go up when property prices go up, because if you buy a property, you need to get a return on your investment, because it's your money you've invested, you want to get a return. So property prices keep going up, then rents go up. That means that the amount of money that you have in your pocket to pay for rent increases, which means the amount of money you've got to save goes down by definition. And at the same time, you have more uncertainty in your work. That means that banks and other financial providers are less likely to lend to you. When I say your generation, a lot of people within it. And that means that all of a sudden, the children of parents who happen to have a property portfolio are from now until I don't know how many 100 years time going to be locked into this very advantageous financial position, whereas a whole bunch of people who are born to parents that don't have a property portfolio are never actually going to be able to enter that market.
Mm.
And so Piketty says, look, if you understand this, you're then going to say, well, what is our government going to do to help allow our society to maintain a level of meritocracy where, you know, you don't have kind of like a class system. So I think that's where the scientific understanding comes in. So Piketty is coming very much from a position of economic science, collects the data, shares it, and then I think if young people are aware of, I guess, this evidence, they're less likely to get conned into buying into discourses and making decisions which are, you know, almost inevitably not going to lead to the outcomes that they think it's going to lead to.
I'm gonna problematize it a bit. So
I mean, could be wrong.
I guess there's sometimes I think the danger is there's a tendency to confuse the scientific method, which is a method, versus trying to use science as like science is becoming like a new religion, if you know what I mean. Because empiricism is good, that's fine, but the whole point of science is not to prove something. I think people miss that. The scientific method, you can only falsify. You cannot verify it because you run to the black swan problem, right? The problem with looking at previous data. So let's say you could observe 1 billion white swans, but that will never prove that all swans are white. Because the next day, if you find a black swan, it will disprove all those observations. But the method is good because that's what allowed us to advance. You just don't believe stuff, you test it. But everything's tentative. So I'm also, while it's sad that there's a lot of unbelievers on climate change, it's also wrong to say that science has proven climate change. It's always tentative, right? It's always, you're always analyzing, you're always looking at new evidence.
I mean, this is why it's important for students to have a good scientific understanding because, I mean, the black swan argument is an interesting one. So I think this is where I think it's important to disentangle the discourse around something and the thing itself, right? So,
yeah,
because there's a lot of language we use in our discourse, which I think confuses, obfuscates, and makes it difficult to engage with in a meaningful way. And this is kind of my kind of criticism of postmodernism. I mean, philosophically, I put myself in the postmodern camp. Like I quite like the work. I'm going to pronounce his name terribly now, so I apologize to everyone out there that is good at pronouncing. I think it's Alain Badiou. No, it basically is this. He is the he is I think the dean or one of the senior people at Normale Sup, a big French university, and he's like a philosopher. He wrote seeds of philosophy books. Now, I don't agree with everything he says, but he kind of has this idea of how can you, because he's quite critical of the difficulty in actually coming to know anything in the context of a postmodern frame and some of these other frames, like constructivist and other frames, right? If I understand them. And so he kind of proposes this idea that you can still know things, but it's kind of within some sort of kind of knowledge structure. I won't get into all the details, but I definitely think that this kind of like not this level of, I guess, nihilism or whatever you want to call it with respect to knowing stuff is a misinterpretation of science, because science has a level of humility built within it. So when we say we know something, we quite often actually do know it. Oh, hang on, you still there? I think you dis. Oh,
yeah.
So everything is tentative and it's a hypothesis, and that's true. And this is actually a structural humility that's built into the system, and what that does is it allows for power structures to be disrupted. So if you're like a junior student in a university and you actually find that the professors are wrong, you know, like there's a retired or close to retiring professor who is up there teaching, and you kind of, you know, you might do an experiment, like you're a science student or a social science, whatever it happens to be. I use the word science broadly, not just natural science, or just the method, as you're saying. So if you're a junior person and you kind of come up with some alternative hypothesis and you can show evidence for it, the scientific community has actually built this mechanism to allow that idea to surface and become part of the discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's really quite nice. It's that exists, which is unlike other kind of social structures. Not to say this always works, because there's no doubt that some really bad ideas have persisted for a very long time within scientific communities, because
Mm-hmm.
usually, and I mean, this is kind of the famous argument about paradigm change, and that is might have been Kuhn or one of the other Thomas Kuhn or one of those people that wrote about scientific paradigms, who I read some stuff that he wrote, and I'm pretty sure he's the one that made the observation that in some disciplines, the new ideas we will have evidence for won't be accepted until the older kind of professors, and I use the word professors as a shortcut for people in power who control
Mm-hmm.
some of the discourse to some extent through their position. He said that you almost have to wait till they retire or die before the paradigm changes. So I'm not saying that this hypothesis and scientific method is perfect by any means, but there is plenty of evidence of the opposite case, where new ideas have come forth from younger people when they get their evidence, and that's displaced the early paradigm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Uh,
so
uh, yeah.
in that context, given that context, I don't think it's correct to say that scientists don't know something. And what I mean by that is, and let's take Newtonian physics as an example. So that's quite often used by social research as an example of paradigm change. And they go, look, Newton was great, and then perhaps he was wrong. Einstein and these other people came along. But what's missing in that, and it's a misinterpretation, is that you still use Newtonian physics to send stuff to the moon.
Oh yeah. So
This is an
it's
important.
actually cumulative. It's cumulative. It's like Newtonian physics still work for things in our scale. So it's perfect. They don't work in the quantum scale or in
Yeah,
the large gravity scale. Yeah.
yeah. So this idea. So when I talk about believing in climate change, one of the things about science is that you kind of have to go with, or when I say you have to, you have skepticism. But when there's a hypothesis for which you can't falsify, or where there's a really good theory which has some sort of internal validity, you don't, like most scientists, don't just discount that because they have an opinion that differs. So there's usually, what you find, some of the top people I know have a huge amount of humility. And so, I mean, I know
Yeah.
this guy, like a genius, man. He's like mathematically very gifted, and he did this work that kind of predicts this. I think, if I understand it, he could predict the stock market at one point in time about 3 to 6 months in advance. He'd worked out this model, so he's very, very good. But if you ask him about areas that are outside of his specific discipline, he goes, "Well, I don't know, don't really know. Maybe these people over here might know." So, which is a little bit. It's kind of like the adage that the more you know, the less you know.
Mhm.
So I mean, it's almost like the mechanism of science allows people to rely on other people's views on things when they're being published and gone through the peer review process in a way that you can't do in other realms. So someone writes a blog about something, it might be an opinion that hasn't been peer reviewed. You don't know if they've lied about stuff. You don't know if it's inconsistent with the earlier systems of knowledge. And so a lot of the discourse around science, the validity of science, is actually made by people that don't understand it.
Yeah.
And
And
so,
yeah.
so and so anyway, yeah, it's just saying it's not so straightforward. And so this gets this kind of idea of the religion idea. And so I've heard probably my whole life this term, and that is that science has become a new religion. And it's a really interesting idea to unpick, because you go, okay, what is a religion? Well, a religion has a bunch of attributes. There's a spiritual attribute, but I mean, if you look at the monotheistic religions, for example, there's usually a text. There's a discipline within the other religions. There's some sort of history there that relates to kind of an understanding of the world, which is interesting. So they have a certain character, and my experience of science is very different to, say, the experience of religion. And I actually think the term or the idea that science is a religion is one of these kind of tricks of language that people have used that has kind of spread quite widely but for which, if you kind of push on it, it really doesn't make sense. Like, it's quite an absurd idea. I mean, within science, you don't have deities. You don't have this idea of.
I guess when I said that term, it's like it's become a religion when you can't question it. But the whole point of science is to question. So I guess that's the term. Yeah, the whole point of the thing is to question everything. And
it's an analogy, right? So if you, let's say, for example, and this is the thing about science, it's all about evidence. It's all about evidence, logic. I mean, you can actually have logic which will then question the evidence. I mean, so it's not just about the empirical side. Science is a lot more than empirics. There's all this other stuff going on.
Yeah.
But it's a bit like these kind of lunatics that kind of write these health blogs and stuff. I mean, honestly, some of the stuff they say is just absurd. That is that they'll actually say things which maybe 30 or 40 years ago we knew was not correct. And so the question is, just because the internet provides them an opportunity to kind of sprout ideas, are they on the same level as, say, the discipline for which those ideas have already been discussed on the whole and usually tested? Is there really, can you actually put them on the same pedestal? And I would say you'd be crazy to. And the reason I say you'd be crazy, it's a bit like you go to the doctor, and these are obviously questions of science. This is different to kind of some of the other social questions, like for which science doesn't really speak to per se. So you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Gee, we've got to chop your leg off." You don't just believe the doctor. You go, "I need some more evidence," and then you wait for you wait for the doctor to go, "Oh, the reason we're going to chop your leg off is because of this," and then you usually get a second and third opinion. And I mean, this is the way science works. So no one individual is the person that knows stuff, but you can come to some sort of knowledge through a critical process. And the idea that you don't make stuff up because you think it's a good idea. I mean, if you take an example of something like paleo diets and really absurd alternative medicines, a lot of this stuff, I think, could be correct. And if you, for example, propose something for which it might be correct, what's the method and the discipline of science would suggest that if you're going to propose this, there's a duty that falls upon you to kind of collect some evidence and see if you can work out if it's valid. And so as soon as you do that, you publish it, you make it available in various forms. There are different publishing forms, and then you have it open for criticism. And that's the scientific method. And what a lot of people who say criticize science simply don't have the ideas which are good enough to actually survive the rigorous scientific process. And so instead of actually justifying their ideas, they criticize science. And it's suboptimal for society because it's confusing, particularly for younger people. That's perhaps a bit, that didn't come out right. It's particularly difficult for people who haven't had the opportunity to form their own views independently of these broader kind of fads.
Yeah, and I think it's become I think it's really hard for people now to discernment. I think it's the key now because we've democratized all the platforms and the internet. Anyone can say anything, but there's also a valid criticism that science is not in a vacuum. So it exists within cultures and society. And I think what we've had is we've had an expert problem. And I guess that's why a lot of countries in the world have gone totally the other side because they've started to mistrust experts. And I think that's a valid point that, for example, the global financial crisis was caused by experts who knew the math, who computed that if we sell these derivatives and all these credit default swaps, the math says it's good, because if we look at all the data, house prices have not all gone down in all states in America. So and then portfolio theory, they could slice up all these assets, and then they created all these derivatives, and they hired quants, they hired math people, they hired, to justify what they're selling. So while the science may have been pure, it was driven by this
Yeah, but I mean, this.
incentive to create to over financialize stuff. And it's funny, like in my other life, I studied the long-term capital management. Like they had the Nobel laureates computing all their bets because they were doing asymmetrical bets, long and short. But none of these experts predicted that Russia will default on its domestic debt instead of its foreign debt, and at the same time, something will happen in Japan. So they thought they knew everything. That I think is the problem is with complexity. No one can see the whole landscape,
Yeah,
and
but
it might be, yeah. So I think
this.
that's the danger, and I think people have become, in a way, what happened is they saw that, but they threw out the baby with the bathwater. You know what I mean? They now they throw everything out and they disbelieve cranks. But I think there's a middle way
I agree.
where we could see, yeah, where we could see what is really useful. That's not obscured by these incentives that created in society. And I think this is a good area in economics
Yeah.
because even in publishing, because I don't know if it's true in Australia, but I've been seeing in the US, there's like this tendency, publish or perish. So you have to keep publishing. There's this incentive to publish. And what you publish are things that confirm. There's rarely papers that publish things that where they did an experiment and then, oh, we didn't find anything. Because that's not interesting. Publication won't publish that. But the problem is with all this computing power, you can p-hack the values, right? You can just keep running regressions until they match. And I think that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
Where,
Well, this.
where we're actually justifying it instead of letting the truth come out.
Yeah. No, but I think you're on the. I agree with some of that at least. So I disagree with the person. What can I say? So I agree with the sentiment that you're expressing, and that is that. And but if you kind of think about this in terms of the overall scientific method, as soon
Yeah.
as you have evidence that goes against the dominant paradigm, it's then the duty of people who see that within the scientific community to critique the hell out of it. So you're right. There is a problem with paradigms and how slow they change. Yeah, and um, I think that's valid. And I agree. The p hacking thing is ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
it's and the publisher perish is problematic. There's quite a few people have discovered amazing things. I think possibly the Wallace and Crick, one of those guys that did some of that early work that was quite fundamental to our understanding of the physical world or biological world. I think they have said that they could never do what they did then now, given the pressures, or they find it difficult. It's not just science, of
Yeah.
course. The same thing was said by either Woodward or Bernstein, one of those two that were part of the people that uncovered the journalists that they made a movie out of them, All the President's Men or something, with Robert Redford. But those guys, the Watergate journalists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Similar thing in that other arena. They said like within journalism also there's this kind of tendency, almost this publish or perish dynamic, that also makes it difficult to do what they did then today. They'd find it
Yeah.
hard to do. Yep. So I agree with that sentiment. But having said that, I don't. What you'll find is that if you, it takes years to get on top of an area. So my students and
Yeah.
myself, when we do a PhD, we might spend 6 months doing nothing but reading. Like in one, like we'll just read like hundreds of papers and just come across them, read them. And now what you'll find at the end of that, you still really don't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I discovered when I was doing some of my work is that a lot of what people said about what people was thinking in terms of like economists and that wasn't entirely correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll give you probably two specific examples. So one is this model called agency theory. Now, agency theory, when I started out, was getting heavily criticized by the sociology kind of focused researchers. And they're saying, oh, this analytical work is problematic. And they basically put a whole bunch of reasons why agency theory was kind of like wrong or now. And they criticized the people that had kind of originally written about agency theory, including there's a famous paper by Jensen and Meckling, were 1976, I think. So what I did, of course, is I read the core papers. And what I found is in the core papers, they acknowledge a lot of the things that they were being criticized about.
Mm.
So one of them was that agency theory only focuses on, say, monetary incentives.
Mm-hmm.
And so sociologists going, oh, you can't use agency theory to explain organizational phenomena because, there are other incentives like need for belonging or, other things. And then you read Jensen and Meckling, and they actually say, look, what they're actually really looking at is kind of some sort of like benefit, and it could be financial, it could be something else. And so what we're talking about here is that people have created strawman arguments to, for whatever reason, usually because they haven't even read the underlying literature. And so then public crowds, and so we've got quite senior people in the community who are saying this. So if you kind of went to a lecture, you'd have like a professor or a doctor getting up and going, "Oh, this is kind of the problem with agency theory," and you'd like consume it, yeah, and then you perhaps put that into your mental model, and that's what you continue to believe, and then you blog about it, someone else might talk, and then you kind of have this creation of a myth. But if you, for example, heard this and then you went back to the root literature, you'd realize that it was exactly that, a myth.
Yeah.
And there's another example in terms of kind of information within markets. So there's this idea about the efficient market hypothesis.
Yep.
Now,
Pharma or so.
yeah, pharma is one of them, but you have the efficient market hypothesis, and there's a useful mechanism to enable the derivation of very simple ideas about how markets work.
Yeah.
So when people criticize finance, they go, "Oh, look, you guys believe in the efficient market hypothesis," and I used to criticize finance for that reason as well. And then, because I actually thought that a lot of the root literature, they actually believed it, like as a belief, like this kind of religious kind of belief, kind of idea.
Yeah.
And then one of my professors, he had this book, like this really old book that I'd never seen before, but it was like one of the core books that's the basis of finance. And so I got a copy and I read it, and they actually acknowledge this. They say markets are not necessarily efficient. Yeah. So this is interesting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is 1960s or 70s, right? So, and this gets back to kind of this idea that if you're going to criticize science, if you're going to criticize knowledge that's being constructed, you really have to take it seriously and do a good job of it, because kind of trite criticisms that most of us do, really, we're probably wrong, more often than we're right. And this idea, for example, and I use health bloggers as an example, where you've got health bloggers that like, the experts don't know what they're talking about, blah, blah, blah. I'm right, I know. And then you kind of, if you apply the scientific method to those people who are sprouting these sort of ideas, you go, what kind of evidence do you have to back it up? And more often than not, there's not really a lot of evidence, to back up a lot of these alternative views, or people would do what we'd call cherry picking the data, which is kind of not that different from p-hacking. So the criticisms of science are also equally valid criticisms of other areas. So what we could be doing as a society is, instead of just kind of saying, "Oh, we are right, they're wrong," and kind of having this kind of discourse, we can join the scientific debates in the respective areas and actually be involved in the construction of the alternative hypotheses, and then creation of data sets and theories and analysis to actually push the ideas along in a manner that kind of is a bit more rigorous.
Yeah,
so
and I think I'm hopeful in that area now, that because we have big data now. I think some studies, they publish the paper and they also publish the data sets. So if someone wants to do it, they can play with it, look at it. And I think that's why things like, open source and Bitcoin or the blockchain, it hasn't been hacked because they published the source code. So it's not a black box. So experts can actually look at the code. And I hope that's what we're going to do with open data and all this open access, so that it's not just because I'm the expert. This is what I think, and this is my supporting data. You can analyze it if you want. I think that we're getting to that world, and I think that's the best. This is the best way to proceed. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I've actually got to head off in a minute, but
yeah,
this is one of the things about this kind of hypothesis method, and that is that even if you don't get access to the data, we encourage our honours students and our PhD students to do this. one of the best things that you can do to make your name in academia is to do kind of what you're suggesting. That is, you kind of take some knowledge construct and then prove it wrong. This is the coolest. If you can do that. And so one of the really funny things with respect to climate change, for example, is that climate change has a bunch of skeptics. There's a bunch of people that say stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, those that have taken their actions kind of seriously and they actually study and they become involved, more often than not, can't disprove hypothesis. And there's lots of examples of this. I mean, you just have to Google it and find out. And so they're not often spoken about as regularly as they should. I'll give you an example of this, by the way, in terms of kind of the constructions of really bad ideas. I mean, climate change is a great example. So there's a bit of a discourse. There's been this constant discourse. So let's take two major players in the anti-climate change movement. Lord Monckton, or whatever his name is. There's some guy, he's like a British chap. He thinks he's a lord, I think. Might well be. You know, he gets paid to go around the world showing a slide deck that apparently shows that climate change isn't happening. Now, being proper scientists, there's a associate professor, Professor Abrams, his name is, from one of the US universities, did the scientific thing. He actually went through the slide deck and criticized every slide. When I say criticized, he actually went and collected evidence. So in Monckton's slide deck, there's, for example, some papers where he says, the author is saying that climate change isn't happening. And so what Professor Abrams did is he'd like send an email to the author and go, this is what Monckton is saying about you. You know, what do you think? What do you say?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just kind of accepting it, he's kind of pushed it to the next level. And so what he does is he actually goes to the entire slide deck and he then puts it on the internet, and which is a good thing to do because it's democratization of data and information. And he puts it into like a kind of like a slide deck with like a voiceover kind of setup, easily accessible. So despite the fact that he's done that, Lord Monckton still goes around saying the same thing again and again.
But then people can then check and cross-refer to that one.
Yeah. So, but instead of people kind of like criticizing Monckton, kind of uncritically, they kind of buy into this whole kind of interpretation of information that I don't agree with, where they kind of accept it. So on one hand, they'll say there's a problem with experts, but then they accept Lord Monckton, who's holding himself as an expert.
But he's not.
There's so many philosophical problems with kind of the way a lot of people interpret information. And the other example from climate change would be Professor Ian Plimmer, I think his name is, he's an Australian professor. He's a geologist, and he wrote this book. It's like huge. It's like a big, thick book. I don't know. It's huge, man. It's like a and in that, he basically tries to show that climate change isn't happening. And so when that book came out, I'm in the area. I like to do a bit of research on climate change, not just the economics, but some of the other stuff. And I read the book, or a large part of it. And based upon what I know from the scientific work, there's a whole bunch of problems with his arguments.
Yeah.
And so I called up one of my people in the community, a couple of place, and asked them about it. And apparently, I could be wrong because I'm relying on my memory here. I think a bunch of people that do research in the space got together, did a bit of a review. Mm-hmm. And I seem to recall that they found at least 900 factual errors.
Mm.
I mean, I found at least two very quickly, and that is that he had like these data sets that kind of, one of them showed a trend, but then if you actually go back to the raw data, the trend kind of didn't go the direction he had, and it ended up that he'd actually drawn it in.
Mm.
All right.
Yeah.
So if I understand it, I mean, I might be wrong, and I mean, but from memory, and another thing is he said that like perhaps volcanic activity wasn't modeling, which is not correct, because if you go to the science, and what had actually happened is the climate, if I understand it, of course, I think he misinterpreted the chemical interaction between, say, a volcano and the ocean, because there's a chemical interaction when you kind of have something new coming into a new area, and then all of a sudden mixing and and so
I guess
and so like you've got kind of a few kind of outliers, and so people tend to like jump onto the outlier because they're like, oh, hey, here's this alternative discourse.
Alternative fact.
I'm part of the this kind of avant-garde group who are like, at the cutting edge because we found this thing that goes against the dominant culture. Now, that is kind of perhaps a problem because that then, if you buy into that set or that kind of like idea, it becomes very easy for you to be manipulated. Because if you think you're on the cutting edge, right, how do you really know, right? So you're going to have some sort of method to find out. And so a lot of people are thinking they're on the knowledge frontier, on the knowledge, but all they're doing is essentially parroting the ideas that are being proposed by people that actually don't know. And so this is one of the problems in modern, I would say modern discourse, particularly amongst, in the tech startup community, there's a fair bit of that, of course, with respect to
disruption is the word, but the first question you should ask is, why do you need to disrupt it? Maybe that's the first question. Is there a need to disrupt? And I guess that's where pragmatism comes in. Like, personally, with me, with my view on climate change, I don't need to know if it's real or not, but I believe that sustainability is good. Whether climate change is proven or not, it's still better to create a circular economy. It's still better to preserve species. So I think some people get hung up on proving whatever, but you can start transitioning to greener things, to more sustainable stuff, without waiting for the proof, right? Why do we need to wait for the proof? It's like simple risk management, right? There's a risk.
I agree with that.
Why not? Yeah, why would you want to take the risk, right?
I agree with that point totally. Of course, the other thing, I like evidence. I think evidence is important because if you use a scientific method, you don't get hoodwinked as often. But just one last thing before I go to run as well is that with respect to the global financial crisis, an interesting case. One, it's so if you think about the way knowledge structures exist, so someone might do an economics degree. And then they call themselves an economist. And they are. But at what point are you on the knowledge frontier? Sorry, someone was just calling me. I've got to run. But so you say, economists didn't predict the global financial crisis. It was like, and that's true. But who?
Some did, a few did, but yeah.
Yeah, but this is an interesting question. So when they say, 50 economists couldn't predict it, who are those economists? Are they the people on the cutting edge, or are they just people who have a degree in economics? You know what I mean? Like there's actually layers of. We're talking about the knowledge structures. It's very easy to kind of get confused with the underlying kind of reality. One thing we do know about markets is this idea of bubbles and kind of how they kind of evolve over time. So
it happened, since the tulip bubble, South Sea bubble. It's I guess it's built in. I think it's part of it.
Well, one of the things that we also know is that, and I have some expertise in this area with valuation, and that is that there are some ways to work out what is not a good investment.
Yeah.
So for example, I agree with the point totally about diversification. So portfolio theory would tend to suggest if you randomly choose stocks and at least 20, there's and that you can't disprove that because it's actually kind of mathematically correct. But what portfolio theory doesn't say is it doesn't suggest that if you take 20 bad stocks that are highly risky,
they're still bad.
It doesn't say that you're going to really diversify. Basic portfolio theory says that if you've got a bunch of, within the distribution, this is a much and perhaps a more informationally efficient way of kind of operating. Which is an interesting idea. So in the case of the global financial crisis, a lot of it was actually really lazy investment. So
and also the insurance, insured stuff that they weren't supposed to insure. I think that's the linchpin there. I think.
Well, the core business model didn't stack up, and that is that people were lending money to people who didn't have money. And then the people who didn't have money, they couldn't pay it back because they didn't have any money.
They just left.
Honestly, you'd have to have rocks in your head to invest in that portfolio. And so what happened is you had intermediaries which lied or at least didn't disclose. So it's actually it's fully kind of explainable using existing models. And so one must not confuse an inability to predict the future, which is very difficult because of non-linearity, with an inability to understand the dynamics that are actually happening in the context of an unfolding system. And this is where a lot of people, I do a fair bit of mathematical modeling, for want of a better word, and you know, you never really know what's going to happen in the future, but you sure as hell can work out some things that aren't going to happen.
Yeah, and as I pointed that there was one guy who earned billions from the financial crisis because he saw the math, and he was an outsider. He wasn't like part of the bubble, and then he said, "Hang on, the maths don't add up." So he bet against them. So he actually one of the few people who benefited from the crash. It's interesting.
Cool. Hey,
because like you look at the model.
Yeah, I've got.
All right.
Always running late.
I guess. Wow.
Right.
I think we could go on forever, but maybe we could do it another. We could schedule another time to discuss more. I'm more interested to know your thoughts on valuation and that, and also market economics. Because we seem to be coming to a time that we can question the role of firms and versus just markets. So we could come to that later.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Sorry for raping it. I tend to, and I find these topics interesting. So.
Yeah, it's really cool. Thank you for giving us your precious time, and I hope we could do this again. And subscribers, thank you for listening, tuning in, share it around, and I'll see you in the next episode. See you, Paul.
Yeah, mate.
Yeah, the rest of your day.